The little black girl begged the biker, saying a torn sleeve of her mom was found beside a frozen hatch. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. It was an unusually cold winter night when the little girl, barely 8 years old, stumbled out of the dark alley. Her small feet, bare and bruised, carried her as fast as they could toward the group of bikers gathered near their bikes. Her chest heaved with desperation, and her eyes were wide, filled with terror. She ran up to the closest biker, a massive man with a leather vest adorned with patches, his face scarred but somehow gentle as he looked down at her. Without missing a beat, she grabbed onto his jacket, her small fingers trembling. "Please, help me," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "They took my mom. They took her, and she's gone. I don't know what to do." The biker's face softened as he crouched down to her level, his calloused hands gently placing a reassuring touch on her shoulder. "Slow down, sweetheart," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "Tell me what happened." The little girl's sobs were quick and loud, almost drowning out her words. "They took her. She was trying to get away, but they hurt her." Her eyes filled with more tears as she continued. "I found her sleeve, a torn sleeve of her coat, beside a frozen hatch, and there's blood on it." The biker felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This wasn't just some stray kid asking for help. This was a call for something deeper, something dangerous. He knew he couldn't turn away. "What's your name, kid?" he asked softly, trying to calm her down. "Amara," she whispered, looking up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. "Amara, listen to me. We're going to help you, okay? We won't leave you alone." Amara nodded, but the fear didn't leave her eyes. "They took my mom, and they're going to hurt her, I know it." The biker stood up, his face hardening. He turned to the rest of his group, a group of men who had lived through more than their fair share of struggles. Yet now they were all bound by something far stronger than loyalty, something much more personal. They were a family, and when a family member was in need, there was no hesitation. "We're going after them," the biker said, his voice steady and commanding. "We'll bring her back, no matter what it takes. No one hurts our own and gets away with it." The rest of the bikers didn't need any more convincing. One by one, they revved their engines, the roar of their bikes filling the quiet street like a storm. It was clear that Amara wasn't just another scared child. She was one of them now, and no one would harm one of their own and walk away. As they mounted their bikes and prepared for the ride ahead, the sky above them darkened even more, but they didn't care. They were on a mission now, and nothing would stop them. They didn't know where this would lead or what dangers awaited them, but they knew one thing for sure. They were going to find Amara's mother, and they were going to bring her home. The ride was just beginning, and it was about to change everything for them all. As the roar of the engines echoed through the night, the group of bikers sped down the darkened highway, their headlights cutting through the fog that clung to the road. Amara, still clinging to the biker she had spoken to earlier, sat in front of him, her small body trembling but grateful to be out of harm's way for now. The chill of the night air didn't seem to bother them. These were men and women who had seen far worse, lived through unimaginable hardships, and come out stronger on the other side. But tonight, their mission was different. Tonight, they were protecting a child, and they were going to make sure nothing and no one stood in their way. The leader of the pack, the biker who had first spoken to Amara, was Jack Hawk Morrison. He had lived through wars, lost friends, and fought battles that no one should have to. But nothing had prepared him for the rage that boiled inside him when he heard the girl's story. They had taken her mother, and they weren't going to get away with it. The cold night air whipped around them as they sped through the empty roads. Jack's fingers gripped the handlebars of his Harley tightly as his mind raced. He couldn't stop thinking about what Amara had said, the torn sleeve, the blood, and the terrifying thought that someone out there, someone with power, was responsible for this. The idea of a man in uniform, a stepfather, no less, doing something like this to a child hit him harder than anything. They had to find her mother, and they had to find her fast. The other bikers moved in formation behind Jack, their bikes humming with power as they traveled at speeds only bikers like them could handle. The road ahead was straight, but they knew what awaited them wasn't. They had little information to go on, just the torn sleeve Amara had found and the direction she had pointed toward. But something about the way she spoke, how her eyes darted nervously and how her voice cracked, told Jack everything he needed to know. They were dealing with more than just a simple kidnapping. This was personal. Jack's mind flashed back to his own time in the service. The promises he had made, the sacrifices he had witnessed, and the brothers he had lost. He thought of his own daughter, of how he would have given everything to protect her from harm. He thought of Amara's mother, lying helpless somewhere, waiting for someone to come. As they approached the exit that led toward the industrial part of town, Jack's gut tightened. This was it. The cold, dimly lit area felt empty, almost too quiet, as if it was waiting for something to happen. Jack waved his hand, signaling the others to slow down. He pulled over to the side of the road, his eyes scanning the surroundings. His heart pounded in his chest. This is where it ends, he muttered to himself. The others parked alongside him, their bikes arranged in a tight line. They weren't here to start a war, but if it came to that, they were ready. One by one, the bikers dismounted, their boots hitting the asphalt with a thud that sounded like thunder. We move fast, we move smart, Jack said, his voice low but firm. We find her, and we don't make any unnecessary noise. We don't want to give them a reason to fight. The other bikers nodded, checking their gear, their faces set with determination. They had all heard the stories about what could happen when you mess with the wrong people. But they weren't scared. They were a family, and they'd fight to the end for each other. Jack, one of the bikers, a burly man named Diesel, spoke up. I'm getting a bad feeling about this. You know something's off when you start chasing people who are hiding in plain sight. Jack nodded grimly. I know, but we don't have a choice. We keep moving. The group spread out, their eyes sharp as they moved through the shadows. Amara clung to Jack's side, her small hands gripping his leather jacket as they walked toward a dilapidated warehouse in the distance. The place was dark and abandoned-looking, the perfect cover for someone trying to hide something, or someone. As they approached, Jack felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. They were close. The sound of footsteps echoed through the empty lot, and Jack signaled for everyone to stop. Stay alert, he whispered. We don't know who we're dealing with yet. The group nodded, their bodies tense, ready for whatever came next. Amara looked up at Jack, her eyes wide with fear but trust. She didn't say anything, but her silence spoke volumes. Jack took a deep breath, then led the group forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. They had to find her mother, and they would stop at nothing to do so. The cold wind howled through the empty industrial lot, the sound of distant traffic barely audible as Jack and the rest of the bikers moved forward. Every step they took felt heavy with purpose. The dilapidated warehouse loomed ahead like a fortress, its broken windows and crumbling brick walls offering little comfort. Amara stayed close to Jack, her tiny hand clutching his leather jacket, her eyes darting around in fear. She had already lived through too much for someone her age. Jack's heart clenched as he looked down at her. He had promised to protect her, and he would keep that promise no matter the cost. The team moved silently, their boots barely making a sound against the gravel. The bikers, usually so loud and boisterous, were now a well-oiled machine, moving with precision. Diesel, a massive man with a scarred face, took point, his eyes scanning every corner of the lot. Behind him, Shadow and Colossus flanked Jack, their senses heightened. Jack knew this wasn't going to be easy. The longer they stayed out here, the more they risked being discovered. Whoever was inside this place had to know they were coming. It wasn't just a kidnapping. This was something bigger, something far more dangerous. As they reached the edge of the warehouse, Jack motioned for them to stop. He crouched down, his hand resting on the ground. The warehouse was dead quiet, too quiet for comfort. There was no sign of life, no movement inside. But Jack wasn't fooled. He could feel it in his gut. They were being watched. He looked over at Diesel, who gave a slight nod, signaling that he was ready. The others were in position, waiting for Jack's command. We move in slow, Jack whispered. No unnecessary noise. We're here for one thing only, to get her out and make sure she's safe. The bikers nodded, their faces grim. The plan was simple, but it was also risky. If they made one wrong move, it could all go south fast. Jack's heart raced as they moved toward the entrance. He glanced down at Amara, whose face was pale with fear but determined. She was trying to be brave, but Jack could see the terror in her eyes. He bent down, gently patting her hand. "Stay close, sweetheart," he said softly. "We're not going to let anything happen to you." They reached the door, and Diesel gently pushed it open, the rusted metal creaking under the pressure. The inside of the warehouse was just as abandoned as it looked from the outside. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of something metallic lingered in the air. But there was something else, something that made Jack's stomach churn. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the place felt wrong. They moved in, the bikers spreading out in pairs to cover all possible exits. Jack's eyes scanned the room, his hand on the grip of his bike's handlebar, ready for whatever came next. He knew this wasn't just some random kidnapping. Whoever was behind this was organized, and they wouldn't give up easily. The silence was suffocating. The only sound their footsteps and the occasional creak of old wood underfoot. Then, a sudden noise from the back of the warehouse caught their attention. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he motioned for the others to stop. There, in the shadows, he saw movement. His hand tightened around the handlebar as his mind raced. "Stay quiet," he whispered. The bikers crouched low, their eyes locked on the figure that was slowly emerging from the darkness. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark jacket. Jack's eyes narrowed as he recognized the familiar figure, Officer Patrick Donovan, the man who had brought Amara's mother to the hospital, the man who was supposed to protect her, but who had, in fact, been her abuser. Jack's blood boiled. He had suspected as much, but now there was no doubt. This was the monster who had caused all of this. The room grew tense as they all waited for Jack's signal. But before Jack could make a move, Donovan spoke, his voice cold and commanding. "You really think you can just walk in here and take what's mine?" His eyes flicked to Amara, who was standing behind Jack, her face a mixture of fear and recognition. Jack's jaw clenched as he took a step forward, his voice steady. "She's not yours, and we're not leaving without her." Donovan sneered, his hand inching toward the gun holstered at his side. Jack's hand moved faster, his fingers brushing against the cold steel of his knife. The tension in the room was unbearable. Amara stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. "You don't scare me," she said, her eyes locking onto Donovan's. "I know what you did to my mom. You're not going to hurt her anymore." Donovan's expression faltered for a moment, his hand pausing midair. But then his smile returned, cold and calculating. "You think you can stop me? You're just a bunch of bikers. You're nothing." The bikers around Jack shifted, ready for the fight that was about to unfold. But Jack held up his hand, signaling them to wait. This wasn't the moment for violence, not yet. "We're not here for a fight," Jack said, his voice low and calm. "We're here to take her home. And if you don't step aside, we will make you." Donovan's eyes flashed with anger, but for a moment, he hesitated. The standoff lasted, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, with a growl of frustration, he lowered his hand and stepped aside. Jack didn't waste any time. He nodded to the others, and they moved in, surrounding Amara and ushering her toward the exit. As they walked toward the door, Jack couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. But he knew this wasn't over. Donovan might have backed down, but the real fight was just beginning. The sound of the Harley engines was a low hum in the night air as Jack and his crew moved swiftly through the shadows, Amara still clinging to him. Her small body trembled, but she was no longer the same scared little girl who had begged for help. She was strong, driven by the need to protect her mother. Jack's protective instinct burned hotter than ever, his mind fixed on getting Amara and her mother out of danger and keeping them safe. The group reached the outskirts of the warehouse district, where the fog settled heavily against the cracked asphalt. The moonlight barely filtered through the mist, casting long shadows across the abandoned buildings. Jack knew this part of town. It was isolated, away from prying eyes, the perfect place for men like Donovan to hide their secrets. They had just managed to escape the immediate threat, but Jack felt the weight of something darker hanging over them. They were far from being out of danger. "Where's her mom?" Diesel asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning their surroundings. Jack's gaze didn't leave the path ahead. He was still in shock from the revelation that Donovan had been behind the abuse. The stepfather, a man sworn to protect, had turned into a monster. The thought gnawed at Jack, making his grip on the bike's handlebars tighten. "She's still inside the warehouse," Jack answered, his voice hard. "We'll get her." But we need to stay smart. We can't rush in blindly. The others nodded, their faces set with determination. They had one goal: to rescue Amara's mother and ensure no one could harm them again. As they approached the warehouse, Jack slowed his bike, signaling for the others to follow his lead. They were close now, close enough to feel the tension in the air. The warehouse stood silent and ominous, but Jack knew that lurking inside was a storm waiting to be unleashed. He glanced down at Amara. "Stay close, okay?" he said gently, his voice softer than usual. "We're almost there." Amara nodded, her tiny face set with a mixture of fear and hope. She had come so far already, and she wasn't going to stop now. "I just want my mom," she whispered. Jack's heart clenched at the sound of her voice. He promised himself he wouldn't let anything happen to her. The bikers dismounted, moving with quiet efficiency as they positioned themselves around the warehouse. Jack felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about saving one woman or one child. It was about standing up to the kind of evil that thrived in the shadows, that preyed on the vulnerable. This was about making sure that Amara and her mother never had to live in fear again. Diesel and Wrench moved toward the side entrance, while Jack and the rest of the crew approached the main door. They were silent, their movements fluid and coordinated, trained to operate as one unit. Jack's thoughts were sharp, each step deliberate, the goal clear. They were going to get in, get the mother out, and leave no trace. But something about the quiet made Jack uneasy. He felt like they were walking into a trap, one that had been set for them all along. The door creaked as Diesel pushed it open. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of darkness, save for the faint glow of moonlight spilling through the cracked windows. There were shadows everywhere, hiding corners, waiting for something to go wrong. Jack's instincts kicked in. "Stay low," he whispered to the group. They moved deeper into the warehouse, their boots barely making a sound. Amara held onto Jack's side, her little hand gripping his jacket tightly as they moved toward the back. There was a sickening feeling in the pit of Jack's stomach. He could feel it in the air. This wasn't going to be as simple as walking in and walking out. As they reached the back of the warehouse, Jack motioned for everyone to stop. His eyes scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. It was then he saw her, Amara's mother, lying on the ground in the far corner, her body motionless. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He immediately moved toward her, his hands shaking as he knelt beside her. She was alive, barely, but her pulse was weak. Her skin was pale, her body trembling with cold. She had been through hell. "Is she okay?" Amara whispered, her voice shaking with worry. Jack looked up at her, his face hard. "She will be," he said, though his voice was filled with uncertainty. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flashlight, shining it on her face. Her eyes fluttered open, but they were glassy, unfocused. She blinked several times before her gaze locked onto Jack. Who are you?" she whispered weakly. "We're here to get you out," Jack said softly, gently lifting her into his arms. "Your daughter's waiting for you." Tears filled Amara's eyes as she ran to her mother's side, clutching her tightly. "Mom," she cried, her voice filled with relief. Her mother's lips trembled as she reached out to touch her daughter's face, her fingers weak but full of love. "Amara," she whispered hoarsely. "I'm so sorry. I thought." "It's okay," Amara interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. "You're here. You're safe now." Jack looked around the warehouse, his mind racing. They had to get out of here, and fast. "We need to move," he said urgently, his voice low but filled with authority. The bikers quickly gathered around them, forming a protective circle. Amara's mother, still barely conscious, was placed on the back of a bike, and Jack took the lead once again. As they made their way out of the warehouse, Jack's mind raced with thoughts of what had just transpired. They had freed Amara's mother, but this was far from over. The real battle was yet to come, and he knew they would have to be prepared for whatever lay ahead. The wind howled louder as the bikers sped down the highway, their engines roaring like thunder in the night. Jack kept his eyes on the road ahead, the cold air biting at his skin as he led the way. His mind was racing. They had successfully rescued Amara's mother, but the danger wasn't over. He could feel it in his bones. Donovan, the officer, wasn't going to let this go. Jack had seen enough in his time to know that a man like that would fight to keep his secrets, and now they were all in danger. The weight of what they had just done hung over him. They had gotten out of the warehouse, but they had made an enemy of someone with too much power. The bikers were a family, a brotherhood, but tonight, they were up against more than just a thug on the street. They were up against the system. Jack glanced over at Amara, sitting in front of him, still clinging to him for comfort. Her mother, though awake now, was too weak to ride herself. She had her arms wrapped around one of the other bikers, looking exhausted but relieved. But Amara's face was still tight with worry, her small body trembling. Is she going to be okay? Amara's voice cracked, breaking through the deafening roar of the engines. Jack could hear the fear in her words, the uncertainty. He hated that he couldn't give her a more reassuring answer. He looked down at her, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. She's going to be fine, Amara. We're getting you both to safety. But even as he said it, Jack knew the truth. They weren't safe yet. The stakes had just gotten higher. The bikers had just made an enemy in the worst possible way. They had stolen a life back from someone who was powerful, someone who would stop at nothing to get it back. They hadn't just taken Amara's mother. They had taken down the man's carefully constructed life of lies, and he would retaliate. Jack's grip on the handlebars tightened as the road stretched out before him. He could feel his mind racing ahead, planning their next move, thinking about what to do if Donovan came for them. They needed to get to the safe house, and fast. As they neared the edge of town, Jack saw the familiar sign for the exit that would lead them to the safe house. It was a small, secluded cabin in the woods, far away from prying eyes. The bikers had used it before, a place to regroup, to lay low when things got too heated. This was their best shot at keeping Amara and her mother safe for now. But there was a problem. Jack could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise as they approached. He had a sinking feeling in his gut. Something wasn't right. As they turned onto the dirt road that led to the cabin, Jack's eyes narrowed. There, in the distance, he saw a figure standing by the gate, silhouetted against the dim light of the moon. It wasn't just any figure. It was Donovan. Jack's pulse quickened. They hadn't made it. Donovan had gotten there first. He didn't know how, but he knew the man had been tracking them. "We've got company," Jack muttered under his breath. He signaled to the others, and the bikers quickly fell into position, ready for a fight if necessary. They weren't going to let anyone take what they had just fought so hard for. The bikers dismounted quickly, forming a defensive line around Amara and her mother. Jack's mind raced. He knew they couldn't fight Donovan out here on open ground. They had to get inside, get to the cabin, and lock the doors. They couldn't afford to get caught out in the open. He motioned for Diesel and Wrench to move toward the cabin's entrance, while he stayed behind to watch Donovan. The other bikers moved quickly, covering the perimeter, checking for any signs of other threats. Jack kept his eyes on Donovan. The officer was standing by the gate, his posture tense, his hands resting on his hips. Jack could feel the man's gaze on him, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Donovan didn't move, didn't speak. It was a standoff. Jack knew that if they tried to make a run for it, Donovan would try to stop them. But if they engaged him here, in the open, it would only end in bloodshed. "What do you want, Donovan?" Jack called out, his voice low and steady. Donovan's eyes flicked over to him, and for the briefest moment, Jack saw a flash of anger in the officer's face. "You really think you can just walk away from this?" Donovan said, his voice harsh. "You've crossed the line. There's no going back now." Jack took a deep breath. He knew this was coming. "I'm not going anywhere," Jack said, his voice sharp. "And neither are they. You're done." Donovan stepped forward, his hands now clenched into fists. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat. "You think I'm just going to let you take my family away from me?" Jack felt the air around them shift, like the calm before a storm. Donovan was pushing him, trying to provoke him into a fight. Jack's hand hovered near the gun at his side, but he knew better than to draw it unless it was absolutely necessary. He wasn't here to kill anyone. He was here to protect. But as Donovan took another step toward him, something inside Jack snapped. "Move!" Jack shouted, and the bikers sprang into action. In a flash, they rushed toward the cabin, making a run for it. Donovan yelled in frustration, but it was too late. They were already inside, the door slamming shut behind them. Jack turned to face the others. "We're not safe yet," he said, his voice grim. "Donovan won't stop until he gets what he wants. We've got to keep moving. We can't let him win." They all nodded in agreement, the weight of the situation settling in. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Jack felt a spark of hope. They had made it this far, and they weren't going to give up now. The sound of the heavy doors slamming shut echoed through the cabin, the stillness outside now replaced by the growing tension inside. Jack paced back and forth, his boots clicking sharply on the wooden floor, his mind racing with every possible scenario. The safe house, which had once been a place of refuge, now felt like a trap. Donovan had found them, and there was no telling how many more were waiting outside. The heavy breath of the bikers filled the room as they positioned themselves, their eyes flicking to Jack, who stood still, his face tight with worry. He turned to Diesel, his voice steady, though he felt anything but calm. "What's our move now?" Diesel glanced out the window, his brow furrowed. "We wait for backup. We can't risk rushing out and getting caught in the open. We need to be ready for whatever he throws at us." Jack nodded, but his eyes drifted to Amara, who sat on the worn couch, holding her mother's hand. Amara's face was pale, but her eyes, those eyes, were filled with a quiet strength. Jack had seen that kind of resilience before. He knew it well. She wasn't a helpless child. She was a survivor, and she wasn't about to give up on her mother. Jack approached her, crouching down in front of her. "You okay?" he asked softly. Amara nodded, but her eyes didn't leave her mother, who was resting with her head leaning against the back of the couch. The exhaustion was evident in every line of her face, and Jack knew they had to get her proper care soon. "I'll stay with her," Amara whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack gave her a reassuring smile. "I know you will." He stood up, his mind once again moving through all the possibilities. They couldn't stay here much longer. They needed to figure out what Donovan had planned, and fast. "We need to get out of here, Jack," Wrench said from across the room, his voice low but urgent. "We've been here too long. If Donovan brings more people, we're stuck." Jack turned to face him, his jaw tightening. "We don't leave until we're sure Amara and her mother are safe. I don't care what happens after that. They're my responsibility now." Wrench didn't argue. He knew how Jack operated. The biker had a code, and when he gave his word, he kept it. The room was tense, the air thick with the weight of their decisions. Jack knew they couldn't stay hidden here forever. Donovan would be back, and when he came, it wouldn't be just him. They would have to fight their way out. Jack moved toward the window, peering through the slats of the blinds. The dim streetlights outside cast long shadows, and Jack's eyes scanned the perimeter. He could feel it, the calm before the storm. The air was heavy, charged with an energy that only came before something big. Something bad. "We can't sit here and wait to get ambushed," Jack muttered under his breath. He turned back to the group, his eyes scanning each one of them. "We're going to need a plan, and we're going to need everyone ready to move at a moment's notice." Diesel stepped forward, his face grim. "I'll take point. You're right, we can't sit around. If Donovan's outside, he's waiting for us to make a mistake." Jack nodded. "All right. We wait until morning, but if we don't hear from backup by then, we move. We get Amara's mother to a hospital, and we leave this town behind." Amara's mother stirred slightly on the couch, her eyes fluttering open. Jack turned to her, concern in his eyes. "She needs medical help," he said quietly, turning back to Diesel. "We can't afford to wait much longer." Diesel nodded, his face hardening. "I'll make the call. We've got contacts, but I'll need to move fast." Jack's eyes lingered on the mother and daughter for a moment longer before he turned away, his mind already working through the next steps. There was a long road ahead, and they weren't out of danger yet. But he wasn't going to lose anyone else. Not on his watch. Not while he had the power to stop it. The night stretched on, but the silence was deafening. Jack's mind kept running over the possibilities, each one worse than the last. What if they didn't make it out? What if they were too late to save Amara's mother? The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it down. He couldn't afford to think like that. He had to stay focused. The bikers, though tough and seasoned, were silent, each one lost in their own thoughts. But the bond they shared was undeniable. They were family, and families fought for each other. They wouldn't let Donovan take what he wanted. The quiet stretched on until the first light of dawn started to peek through the cracks in the curtains. Jack stood by the window, his eyes scanning the empty street. His heart raced in anticipation, but he knew they couldn't wait forever. They had to make a move, and they had to do it now. "Time's up," Jack said, turning back to the group. "Get ready. We move out in 5 minutes. If Donovan's still out there, we're going to show him we're not running anymore." The bikers stood up, their movements swift and purposeful. They knew what was at stake. Jack's eyes met Amara's one last time. She was scared, but she was strong. He had promised to keep her and her mother safe, and he wasn't going to break that promise. Not now. Not ever. The first rays of dawn pierced through the cracks in the wooden blinds, signaling the start of a new day, but for Jack and the bikers, the night had only just begun. The tension inside the cabin was palpable, and every biker felt it. Their nerves were on edge, their focus sharpened. The time had come to make their move. Jack looked around at the group, his eyes meeting theirs one by one. Each of them knew what was at stake. They weren't just protecting Amara and her mother anymore. They were taking a stand. They were sending a message to anyone who thought they could take what didn't belong to them. All right, we're moving out, Jack said, his voice calm but filled with authority. Get your gear. We're not wasting any more time. Diesel, Wrench, and the rest of the bikers sprang into action, grabbing their jackets, checking their bikes, and ensuring everything was in place. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They weren't just a group of bikers. They were a family, a team forged in fire. And now, it was time to ride again. Amara's mother, still weak from the ordeal, had managed to sit up, her eyes dull but filled with gratitude. Jack gave her a reassuring smile as she reached out for Amara, who was standing close by. Are you sure you're okay? Jack asked, his voice soft but firm. Amara's mother nodded, though it was clear she was still struggling. I'll be all right, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Just get us out of here. Jack turned to the group. We're not stopping until we're safe. We're getting them both to the hospital, and then we'll figure out what's next. The bikers nodded in unison, knowing exactly what that meant. They weren't just running. They were protecting, and nothing was going to stand in their way. As they moved out of the cabin, the cold air hit them like a slap in the face. The fog had begun to lift, but the sense of unease was still there. The danger hadn't passed, it had only shifted. Jack mounted his bike, feeling the familiar rumble of the engine beneath him. He gave a brief glance to the others, signaling that it was time to go. The engines roared to life, cutting through the quiet morning like a storm. They rode in formation, their bikes lined up in a tight group, ready to move as one. Jack kept his focus ahead, his eyes constantly scanning the road. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Donovan was still out there, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he came for them. They had no illusions about what this meant. The bikers weren't just protecting Amara and her mother. They were taking a stand against a system that had failed them both. The road ahead was long, but Jack wasn't about to stop until they were far from this place, until they were out of Donovan's reach. They sped down the highway, the wind whipping past them, the sound of the engines the only thing breaking the silence. The ride felt almost surreal, the calm before the storm. As they neared the outskirts of the town, Jack's eyes narrowed. He could feel it. Something wasn't right. The air had changed, and he knew they were being watched. He glanced to his left and then to his right, trying to spot anything unusual. That's when he saw it. A shadow moving quickly between the trees at the edge of the road. His heart skipped a beat. We've got company, Jack muttered, his voice low but urgent. Stay sharp. The bikers reacted immediately, falling into defensive positions. They had been expecting this. Jack's grip on the handlebars tightened as they reached a sharp bend in the road. He signaled to Diesel and Wrench to take point while the others formed a protective ring around Amara and her mother. It was all happening so fast, and Jack's mind raced with the possibilities. They were close to safety, but they had to stay vigilant. There was no room for mistakes. Suddenly, the sound of tires screeching pierced the air. Jack's heart lurched as he saw a black SUV barreling down the road toward them, the headlights blinding. Get ready, Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The bikers revved their engines, preparing for what was about to come. The SUV was closing in fast, and Jack knew they couldn't let it get any closer. Move, Jack ordered. Without hesitation, the bikers scattered, swerving their bikes to create a blockade in the middle of the road. The SUV slammed on its brakes, screeching to a halt just feet away from them. Jack could see Donovan's face through the windshield, his eyes filled with rage. This ends now, Donovan yelled, his voice carrying through the open window. Jack didn't hesitate. He shot forward, his bike roaring as he closed the distance between them. The others followed suit, their bikes weaving in and out of traffic, forming a circle around the SUV. You're not taking them, Jack said, his voice cold and unwavering. Donovan's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, It seemed like he was considering his options. But then, without warning, he threw the SUV into reverse, speeding backward as fast as he could. Jack's heart raced as he watched him retreat. This wasn't over yet. Stay with them, Jack shouted to the others, motioning to Amara and her mother. We're not done here. The bikers moved swiftly, closing in on the SUV as it sped down the road. The chase was on, and Jack knew it was only a matter of time before this all came to a head. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting for their lives. For Amara, for her mother, for the future they all deserved. The chase was relentless, the roar of the engines reverberating through the quiet morning air as Jack and the bikers closed in on Donovan. The black SUV was weaving through the streets, desperate to escape, but it couldn't outrun the fury of a dozen bikers, each one of them hell-bent on stopping him. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he leaned into his bike, his eyes locked on the road ahead. Donovan was just a few hundred yards in front of them now, the SUV speeding down the narrow streets like a man on the run. Jack could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but he knew they couldn't keep up this pace forever. We've got to block him off, Diesel shouted over the sound of his engine. If he gets to the highway, we lose him for good. Jack nodded, his grip tightening on the handlebars. Cut him off before he makes it to the bridge. The bikers immediately adjusted their positions, weaving in and out of traffic, the group moving like a coordinated unit, each one anticipating the next move. They had done this countless times before, but this time, it was different. This wasn't just a high-speed chase. This was personal. For Jack, it was about more than just getting away from Donovan. It was about justice for Amara and her mother. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. They had already been through too much, and Jack wasn't going to let it end now. The SUV made a sharp left turn, the tires screeching against the pavement as Donovan tried to make his getaway. Jack wasn't far behind, closing the gap with every turn, his heart beating in time with the pulse of the engines. He's not getting away, Jack muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. They reached the bridge, the narrow path cutting across a river below. It was the perfect place to stop him, but it also meant a dangerous game of cat and mouse. If Donovan wasn't careful, he could end up in the water. Jack's mind raced, calculating the best angle of attack. They couldn't just ram the SUV and risk losing control. No, they needed to box him in. They needed to trap him, force him to make a mistake. Jack glanced to his right, catching Diesel's eyes. It was time. Move now, Jack shouted, signaling for Diesel and the others to take the lead. The bikers surged forward, their engines roaring as they formed a barricade on the bridge, cutting off the SUV's path. Donovan slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. He was trapped. The SUV skidded to a halt just inches away from the edge of the bridge. Jack brought his bike to a stop, his eyes locked on Donovan through the windshield. Donovan's face was twisted with fury, his hands gripping the wheels so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He looked like a man who had been pushed to the edge. Get out of the vehicle, Jack ordered, his voice calm but firm. Donovan didn't move, his eyes burning with defiance. You think you can just come in here and take everything I've worked for? Donovan spat. You have no idea who you're messing with. Jack's eyes narrowed. I know exactly who you are, he said, his voice low and dangerous. And I'm not going to let you hurt anyone else. Donovan's jaw clenched, his eyes flicking to the bikers surrounding him. Jack could see the gears turning in his head, the calculations running through Donovan's mind. But he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. Get out, Jack repeated, his voice colder this time. Now. There was a long, tense silence. Then, finally, Donovan threw the door open and stepped out, his hands raised in surrender. The bikers immediately moved in, surrounding him. Jack dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. You've got a choice, Jack said, his voice cold. You can walk away, and we'll let you go. Or you can face the consequences of what you've done. Donovan sneered, his eyes flashing with anger. You think you can just tell me what to do? You think you can just... He stopped mid-sentence as he noticed. The bikes, the men standing behind Jack, the weight of the situation sinking in. You've already lost, Jack said. Your time's up. Donovan's expression faltered for a moment, but then it hardened again. I won't go down like this, he growled, his hand slowly moving to his waistband. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't surprised. He had known Donovan would try something. The man had too much pride to go down quietly. "Drop it," Jack ordered, his voice razor-sharp. But Donovan didn't listen. In a split second, his hand was on the gun, pulling it free from his waistband. Time seemed to slow as Jack moved, his instincts kicking in. He lunged forward, grabbing Donovan's wrist before the gun could be raised. They struggled for a moment, the gun slipping between them, the tension thick in the air. "You don't have to do this," Jack said, his voice fierce. "You're not getting away." But Donovan wasn't listening. With a sudden twist, Donovan broke free, pushing Jack back with surprising strength. Jack stumbled, but his focus never wavered. He had to end this now. He couldn't afford to let Donovan get away, not after everything they'd been through. In a flash, Jack reached for his own weapon, a knife tucked into his boot. He didn't want to use it, but he knew there was no other choice. As Donovan raised his gun, Jack lunged, knocking it from his hand and sending it flying across the bridge. The two men grappled, their movements swift and brutal. Jack's heart pounded as he fought to gain control, to end the fight once and for all. Donovan wasn't giving up easily, but Jack was determined. He wasn't going to let this man hurt anyone else. Finally, with one swift move, Jack pinned Donovan to the ground, his hand pressing against his throat. "It's over," Jack said, his voice cold and final. Donovan's breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled beneath Jack's weight. He knew he had lost. Jack had won. The bikers gathered around, their faces grim but relieved. They had done it. They had stopped Donovan, and they had made sure that Amara and her mother were safe. Jack stood over Donovan, his chest heaving with exertion. He knew this wasn't over. But for now, they had won. And that was enough. The morning sun had barely started to break through the thick fog that had settled on the town, casting a pale light over the abandoned streets as Jack and his crew moved quickly. They had done it. They had taken down Donovan. But the job wasn't over yet. There was still so much left to do. As the bikers moved toward their bikes, Jack's eyes stayed fixed on the SUV, still parked in the middle of the bridge, its engine turned off and the tires spinning silently in place. It felt like a momentary victory, but he knew better than to get comfortable. They had to get Amara and her mother to safety, and they couldn't afford any more delays. Jack looked over at Diesel and Wrench, who were already checking the perimeter for any signs of danger. "What now?" Diesel asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the empty streets. "We move out," Jack said, his tone firm. "We've got to get Amara and her mom to the hospital. Then, we lay low. This isn't over. We still don't know who else might be out there." The group nodded, their faces set with determination. They knew what had to be done. They weren't just running anymore. They were protecting the ones they cared about, and they were going to keep fighting for them. The bikers mounted their motorcycles one by one, the sound of the engines echoing through the empty streets. Jack revved his bike, his mind already racing through the possibilities of what might come next. Donovan was down, but that didn't mean the danger was gone. It wasn't just about Amara's mother anymore. It was about taking down a whole system of corruption, a system that had been allowed to flourish for far too long. Jack wasn't going to stop until every last person responsible paid for their actions. As they rode through the streets, Jack could feel the tension easing from his shoulders just slightly. They were getting away. They were on the move, and they had made it past the first hurdle. But the thought of Donovan still haunted him. He knew the man was too dangerous to stay down for long. The bikers rode in formation, keeping their pace steady and swift, their eyes constantly scanning for any signs of trouble. It wasn't long before they reached the outskirts of the town, and the familiar sight of the safe house came into view. Jack's pulse quickened. As he saw the cabin in the distance, the lights dim but still flickering from within. They had made it. But they couldn't stop just yet. The road to safety wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. "We're almost there," Jack muttered under his breath, glancing back at Amara, who was riding behind him, her face still tense with worry. Her mother, though awake, was too weak to ride, and one of the other bikers had volunteered to carry her on the back of his bike. Jack could see the pain in Amara's eyes, the uncertainty. It wasn't just about finding safety now. It was about rebuilding the life that had been shattered. They had all been through so much, and the fight wasn't over. Jack looked at her, offering a small smile. "We're getting you both safe. I promise you it's going to be okay." Amara nodded, though her face still carried the weight of everything she had seen. Her mother was still in bad shape, and the fear that had taken root in her heart hadn't gone away. They needed to get her to the hospital, but even then, Jack knew it wouldn't be the end. They would need to stay on the move. They needed to disappear. They needed to make sure that Donovan's grip on their lives was finally severed. The group turned off the main road and onto the dirt path that led to the cabin. Jack's heart raced with every bump in the road, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. The trees were thick around them now, their dark shadows casting a veil over the landscape. The sense of isolation was almost overwhelming, but Jack knew this was the place to regroup. He had spent years making sure this safe house remained hidden, and it had never let him down. But now, more than ever, Jack knew they needed to be cautious. "Stay sharp," Jack said, his voice low but firm. The bikers dismounted, setting up a perimeter around the cabin. They didn't know how much longer they would be able to stay hidden. Donovan had eyes everywhere, and Jack was certain that he wouldn't be alone for long. But for now, the cabin was their best chance at getting some rest, at making sure Amara and her mother were cared for. As the bikers moved into the cabin, Jack caught sight of Amara, standing outside in the fading light, looking up at the darkening sky. She looked so small, so vulnerable, but in her eyes, there was something more, something that spoke of strength, of resilience. Jack walked over to her, his footsteps heavy on the gravel. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer this time. Amara turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared. I'm scared for my mom, for everything. I don't know what's going to happen now." Jack knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to know what happens next," he said, his voice steady. "We're here, and as long as we're here, we'll make sure you're safe. You and your mom." Amara gave him a small, hesitant smile, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Jack stood up, looking back at the group. They had come this far, but the fight was far from over. The real battle would begin when Donovan came for them again. And Jack was ready. He had no intention of letting anyone else suffer the way Amara had. He wasn't going to let the darkness win. Not this time. Not on his watch. The sound of the motorcycles had finally quieted, the roar of the engines now replaced by the tense silence that hung in the air inside the cabin. The bikers moved swiftly, checking the surroundings and making sure the area was secure, but Jack knew that their time here was limited. They couldn't stay in one place for too long, not with Donovan out there, not with the chaos he had already started. Jack paced back and forth, his mind running through scenarios, weighing his options. He had promised Amara that they would be safe, that they would get through this, but the threat wasn't over. Donovan had already proven how far he was willing to go. Jack's hand rested on the worn handle of his motorcycle, the cold steel grounding him in the moment. The door creaked open behind him, and he turned to see Diesel enter the room, his face set with determination. "We've got a problem," Diesel said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. "What now?" Diesel's eyes flicked to Amara, who was sitting at the table with her mother, both of them, exhausted but trying to hold it together. "We just got word. Donovan's not done. He's got more people. They're already looking for us." Jack's stomach dropped. He had been expecting something like this, but hearing the confirmation hit him harder than he anticipated. He knew that Donovan wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted, until he had Amara and her mother back under his control. Jack clenched his fists, his heart pounding. "How much time do we have?" Diesel looked grim. "Not long. They're on their way, and they're moving fast." Jack turned to face the group of bikers, each one of them listening intently. The weight of the situation was heavy on their shoulders, but there was no hesitation in their eyes. They knew what had to be done. "We're not running anymore," Jack said, his voice calm but full of resolve. "We're going to fight. We're going to protect Amara and her mother, no matter what it takes." Diesel nodded, his face hardening. "We've got your back, Jack." Wrench, standing near the door, stepped forward. "We'll make sure they don't get through. But we need to move now. We can't wait for them to reach us first." Jack's gaze shifted to Amara and her mother, both of them now looking up at him. Amara's mother, though still weak, had a look of gratitude in her eyes. She knew the danger they were in, but she also knew that Jack wasn't going to let anything happen to them. "We'll get you to safety," Jack said softly to Amara's mother, his voice filled with determination. "You don't have to worry. We won't let him take you again." Amara's mother gave him a weak smile, though her exhaustion was evident. She reached for Amara's hand, pulling her closer. "Thank you." she whispered, her voice shaky. I don't know what we would have done without you. Jack nodded, but his focus never wavered. He turned back to the group, his eyes scanning their faces. We need to move. Now. Diesel, Wrench, you're with me. The rest of you, secure the perimeter. Make sure no one gets in or out without us knowing. The bikers moved quickly, their training kicking in as they prepared for what was to come. The room was alive with movement as they gathered their gear, checking weapons and making sure everything was in place. Jack felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, but he knew that they had come too far to back down now. They were going to make sure Amara and her mother were safe, no matter what. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Jack felt a knot in his stomach. The danger was closing in, and every second they waited was another second that Donovan and his people had to find them. But there was no turning back now. Jack motioned for the group to follow him. Let's go, he said, his voice firm. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, the familiar sound of the engines roaring to life once again. Jack led the way, his heart racing, his mind focused on the road ahead. The sky above them was dark, the early morning light still weak against the heavy fog that clung to the ground. They rode through the winding roads, their headlights cutting through the mist like a beacon. Jack kept his eyes on the path ahead, his senses on high alert. He could feel the tension building, the knowledge that Donovan's people were closing in on them. He wouldn't let them get through, not without a fight. As they neared the edge of town, Jack glanced back at Amara and her mother, who were riding with Diesel. The fear was still in Amara's eyes, but there was also a glimmer of something else, something that told Jack she was ready. She wasn't just a scared little girl anymore. She was a survivor, and she was going to make it through this. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a distant engine. His heart skipped a beat as he realized they were being followed. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Donovan was coming, and this time, there would be no escape. Get ready, Jack said, his voice low and steady. The bikers shifted into position, their engines revving as they prepared for what was to come. Jack knew this was the moment. The final showdown. He wasn't going to let Donovan take them. Not again. This time, it would end for good. The road stretched before them, the fog thickening, and the early morning light barely making a dent in the grayness. Jack's grip on the handlebars was steady, but his mind was in overdrive. He could feel the weight of what was coming, the quiet. Before the storm, but there was no turning back now. He had made a promise to Amara and her mother, and he was going to keep it. The sound of the motorcycles roared through the fog, but it wasn't just the bikers now. Jack could feel something else, something heavier, something dangerous, just beyond the mist. He knew Donovan and his crew were close, closer than he wanted them to be. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. The group rode in a tight formation, each biker focused on their role, moving with precision. Diesel and Wrench were flanking the rear, ensuring no one was tailing them. The rest of the bikers formed a protective ring around Amara and her mother, who were riding just behind Jack. Jack stole a glance at them in the rearview mirror. Amara's face was still filled with worry, but there was something else in her eyes now, strength. She wasn't just a scared little girl anymore. She had become part of this fight, and Jack wasn't going to let her down. They passed the last sign for the town, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. He knew they were getting close to the outskirts, but that also meant they were running out of options. The safe house was just ahead, but there was no guarantee that they would make it there without being intercepted. He glanced back at Amara, her small form barely visible in the rearview. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the pressure to get them to safety. His fingers tightened around the throttle, urging the bike faster, even though he knew they couldn't risk drawing attention. Suddenly, a distant sound broke through the fog. The unmistakable sound of another engine revving. Jack's heart raced as he flicked his eyes to the side mirror. There, in the distance, a dark shape emerged, closing the gap between them. Donovan was here. Jack's instincts kicked in, and he waved his arm to signal the others. "We've got company," he yelled, his voice cutting through the wind. Immediately, the group of bikers shifted into formation, their bikes moving in a coordinated dance, ready for whatever was coming. Jack could see the headlights now, the dark SUV following them, its engine roaring like an angry animal. The gap between them was closing fast, and Jack knew they didn't have much time. "Get ready to move off the main road," Jack shouted, his voice tense with urgency. The bikers veered off the road onto a narrow dirt path, winding through trees and thick brush. The fog made it almost impossible to see ahead, but Jack knew they had to take a chance. This path would lead them to the safe house. The sound of the SUV's engine grew louder as it followed them, but Jack wasn't going to let Donovan catch them. Not after everything they had fought for. Keep pushing, Jack urged the group. His heart was pounding now, each beat echoing in his chest. They couldn't slow down. They had to outrun them, or at least make it to the safe house before Donovan had a chance to close in. The dirt road was rough, the uneven terrain making it hard to maintain speed, but Jack pushed through, his focus razor-sharp. He could hear the others behind him, their engines roaring as they maneuvered through the fog and trees. The SUV wasn't far behind, but it was struggling to keep up. The terrain was too rough for them. "We're almost there," Jack said, his voice steady despite the panic starting to rise in his chest. He knew they were getting close, but he also knew that if they didn't make it to the safe house soon, it would all be over. The path ahead curved sharply, and Jack hit the throttle, feeling the familiar hum of the bike beneath him. He could see the edge of the forest up ahead, the clearing that would lead them to the cabin. They were almost there. But then, just as Jack thought they were in the clear, he heard the screech of tires behind him. The SUV was too close now. "They're not giving up," Jack muttered to himself. "We need to make a stand." He motioned for the others to move ahead, signaling for them to get to the cabin while he held off Donovan. It was a risky move, but there was no other choice. The bikers surged forward, their bikes slicing through the mist, while Jack slowed down, positioning himself between the SUV and the path leading to the cabin. He could feel his pulse racing, but he kept his eyes locked on the rearview mirror, watching as Donovan's SUV drew closer, the headlights glaring in his face. Come on, Jack muttered, his hands tight on the handlebars. The sound of the engine grew louder, and then, just as Donovan's SUV was about to overtake him, Jack swerved into the path, cutting the SUV off. The two vehicles screeched to a halt, the tires leaving marks in the dirt. Donovan's face was twisted in fury, his eyes locked on Jack. "You think you can stop me?" The roar of the engine drowning out everything else. He could feel the wind whipping against his face, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't going to stop until Amara and her mother were safe. He could see the headlights of the SUV in the distance now, cutting through the fog like a predator tracking its prey. Jack knew Donovan wasn't going to give up, but Jack wasn't going to let him win. He glanced back at Diesel and Wrench, who were riding just behind him. They were ready. They had all fought too hard to get this far. "Stay tight," Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the wind. "We're almost there." Diesel and Wrench nodded, falling into line behind Jack as they made their way toward the cabin. The dirt path became steeper, and the turns more treacherous. Jack's heart was in his throat, but his instincts were sharp. He knew this path better than anyone. He had ridden it countless times before, but this time was different. This time, everything was on the line. They could see the cabin now, just ahead, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light of the early morning. Jack's stomach churned with anticipation. They were close. But then, just as they reached the clearing, the unmistakable sound of tires screeching filled the air. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He turned around just in time to see the SUV coming up behind them, its headlights blinding, the vehicle swerving dangerously as Donovan tried to close the gap. Jack pushed his bike harder, the engine screaming as he accelerated, but he knew they couldn't outrun the SUV for long. He had to make a stand. They were almost at the cabin. He signaled to the others. "Take the left side," Jack shouted. "We're going to trap them." The bikers spread out, their bikes moving in perfect synchrony as they blocked off the road, forcing the SUV to slow down. Jack's heart raced as he guided his bike toward the cabin's entrance, the sound of the engines surrounding him like a thunderstorm. They were going to make it. They were going to stop Donovan. As the SUV approached, Jack saw Donovan's face in the rearview mirror, his eyes burning with rage. Jack knew this wasn't over, but it was their best chance. The SUV was closing in, its tires screeching against the gravel. Jack took a deep breath, focusing. He wasn't going to let them take Amara and her mother. Not again. The moment had come. Jack slammed his foot on the brake, skidding to a stop just in front of the cabin, his bike's tires screeching as he blocked the entrance. The other bikers followed suit, quickly surrounding the SUV. Jack's heart was in his throat as he dismounted, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from the anticipation of what was about to happen. He turned to face Donovan, who was still behind the wheel, his fists clenched on the steering wheel. Donovan's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of the bikers surrounding him. "You think you can stop me?" Donovan spat, his voice filled with venom. "You think you're the law?" Jack's voice was steady, but his words were sharp. "You're done, Donovan. This ends now." Donovan sneered, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "You think you can just take everything from me? You don't know who I am." Jack took a step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath him. "I know exactly who you are," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I'm done letting people like you destroy lives. This is over." Donovan's eyes flashed with anger, but Jack didn't flinch. He could feel the other bikers closing in, their eyes on Donovan, waiting for the order to move. But Jack didn't need to say anything more. He knew Donovan had already lost. The question now was how far Donovan was willing to go to try and hold on to his power. Jack knew the answer. Donovan wasn't going down without a fight. But Jack wasn't going to let him. He wasn't going to let him destroy any more lives. The tension in the air was thick, the stillness around them almost suffocating. Jack kept his eyes locked on Donovan, waiting for any sign of movement. He wasn't going to give Donovan a chance to run or to strike first. They were going to end this right here. The sound of the wind was the only thing that broke the silence, but even that felt heavy, like the calm before the storm. And Jack knew, with every beat of his heart, that the storm was coming. The silence was unbearable as the two sides stood locked in a tense standoff, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind through the trees and the distant hum of the early morning. Jack's eyes never left Donovan, who remained behind the wheel of the SUV, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. For a moment, it seemed like time had stopped, the weight of everything hanging in the air. The bikers surrounded Donovan, their eyes hard and their postures set, ready for anything. Jack could feel the heat of the situation, the inevitability of what was about to unfold. He wasn't going to let Amara and her mother fall into the hands of this man again. "You don't scare me," Donovan growled, his voice strained with anger. "You have no idea what you've started." Jack took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "I know exactly what I've started," Jack said, his voice calm, but with a steel edge. "I've started the end of your reign of terror. It's over, Donovan. We're not running anymore." Donovan's eyes flickered for a brief moment, a flicker of uncertainty, but it was quickly replaced by rage. "You think you can just stop me like this? You think you've won?" Jack took another step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel beneath him. "You're done," he said, his words cutting through the tense air. "You're not going to hurt anyone again." Donovan's hand tightened on the steering wheel, but Jack saw the hesitation in his eyes. He was a man out of options, trapped in his own lies. He had nothing left but his anger and pride. "It doesn't have to be this way," Donovan said, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "I can still make this right. I can fix this." Jack shook his head slowly. "It's too late for that. You crossed the line, and now you're going to pay for it. You're not walking away from this." There was a long pause, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Then, without warning, Donovan lunged forward, his hand reaching for something under the seat. Jack's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he sprang into action, moving faster than he had ever moved in his life. He grabbed Donovan's wrist before the man could pull a weapon, twisting it until Donovan let out a sharp cry of pain. The gun flew from his hand and skidded across the dirt. Jack held Donovan down, his knee pressed into the man's chest, pinning him to the seat. "This is over," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "You're not getting away." Donovan's breathing was heavy, his face twisted in fury, but Jack saw the fear in his eyes. This was the end for him. The fight was over. The bikers closed in, their faces grim, but there was no joy in this victory. They had fought hard for it, but it wasn't about pride or winning. It was about protecting the innocent, about making sure Amara and her mother were safe. And now, they had succeeded. Jack stood up, his eyes never leaving Donovan as the man struggled beneath him. "You'll answer for what you've done," Jack said quietly, his voice steady. "You'll answer to the law now." Donovan remained silent, his rage still boiling beneath the surface, but there was nothing he could do. He had been defeated. The bikers had won. As the authorities arrived, the sound of sirens filled the air, a stark contrast to the tense silence that had come before. Amara and her mother, both looking exhausted but relieved, stood at the edge of the cabin, watching the scene unfold. Amara's mother, though weak, managed a small smile as she saw Donovan being taken away in handcuffs. She reached for Amara's hand, squeezing it gently. "It's over," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "It's finally over." Amara looked up at her mother, her face still lined with fear, but there was something else in her eyes now. Hope. Jack watched them for a moment, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. They had done it. They had fought for what was right, and they had made sure that Amara and her mother were safe. The rest of the bikers gathered around, their faces tired but resolute. They had all made sacrifices, and though the fight was over, the road ahead was still uncertain. One thing was clear: they had each other's backs. The bond between them was unbreakable. "Let's get out of here," Jack said, his voice breaking the silence. "We've done what we came to do." The group mounted their bikes once again, the sound of the engines filling the air as they started down the road. Jack looked back one last time at the cabin, the place where they had fought so hard for their victory. They had won this fight, but Jack knew there would be more battles ahead. The road to safety was never easy, but with his crew by his side, Jack was ready for whatever came next. They weren't just bikers, they were a family, and nothing was stronger than family. As they rode off into the distance, the first rays of the sun broke through the horizon, casting light on a new day, a new beginning. For Amara, for her mother, for them all.